Good afternoon, and welcome to the third talk in this year's Contemporary History Institute speaker series. We're delighted that today's speaker, Dr. Karen Greenberg, has piqued your interest. We're in particular debt to War and Peace Studies and its director, Nuket Sandal, for generously co-sponsoring today's event. For those of you who are new to these occasions, my name is Ingo Trauschweitzer. I'm the director of CHI, and we are a multidisciplinary institute that joins the perspectives of history, of economics, political science, and journalism in an effort to make sense of the questions that define our time. And today, those questions touch on the war on terror and on its effects on the American state and on American society, particularly in areas of law and liberty and justice. So Dr. Karen Greenberg comes to us from New York City, where she directs the Center on National Security at Fordham Law School, or Fordham University's Law School, I should say. She earned her BA from Cornell and her PhD in history from Yale University. Her newest book is Rogue Justice: The Making of the Security State, which appeared with Crown Publishing last year, wherein she explores the issues that she'll talk about today in greater depth and with a little bit of an update, since this is kind of a moving target, the effects of the war on terror. Before that, Professor Greenberg published widely in a range of edited and co-edited volumes, but also her own single-authored The Least Worst Place, Guantanamo's First 100 Days, which appeared with Oxford University Press in 2009 and earned Best Book recognition from the Washington Post and Slate. Aside from teaching at Fordham, Karen Greenberg is a permanent fellow of the Council on Foreign Relations and a noted expert in questions of national security, terrorism, civil liberties, who weighs in on public debates in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the LA Times, The Nation, and elsewhere. So this afternoon, Professor Greenberg will speak for about 50 minutes or so about today's landscape, or today's national security landscape, and we'll follow that with the pretty standard procedure of a question and answer period of about 45 minutes or so. But once again, I'll offer the opportunity for those who have maybe other pressing commitments and want to pretend that they can leave with a clean conscience to do so. So we'll take a short break, a minute or so between the formal remarks and the Q&A. So with that, I hope you'll join me in welcoming Dr. Greenberg to Athens, to CHI, and to Ohio University.
So thank you, Ingo. Thank you, James, for picking me up today. Thank you, Connie, for making all these arrangements so that I could actually get here, despite the fact that my plane was delayed an hour and a half, New York style. And I'm really delighted to be here, actually, because I'm mostly looking forward to the Q&A, because I want to know what you guys are thinking about what's going on in our world. And actually, when you invited me to give this lecture, you couldn't possibly have known what was going to happen this week, which is that Guantanamo, and I'm going to get to this at the end, but I just want you to know where we're going. Guantanamo is in complete crisis, disarray, and a media blackout. And in fact, we should really stop at 5 o'clock so we can find out what's happening at the hearing. But maybe you'll find out. We've had a terrorist attack in New York, the first lethal one since 9/11, and we have a number of people who are slated to be enemy combatants. So it's almost like I could write Rogue Justice 2, and I'm going to give you I'm going to tell you what happened from the beginning of the war on terror to now, at least how I see it, in a very much interdisciplinary way. And then what I think I'd like to do is to run through what I think the last chapter of this book would have been if I'd had to turn it in on December 1st instead of a year and a half ago. So let me just begin by giving you some overview of what I think the larger. I want to talk to you about the shape of what happened from 9/11 to now. And my particular interest is the intersection between constitutional principles, and civil liberties and national security. And I thought I'd just tell you a little bit about what I do so you'll understand how this information gets in my head, which is that I founded an institute in 2003 at NYU called the Center on Law and Security. And I moved it 7 years ago to Fordham. It was at NYU Law School, and now it's at Fordham Law School. But we have done the same thing consistently throughout. And we do a variety of things, but one of the things we do is that we host a number of private, off-the-record discussions with public officials, practitioners, and their critics about what they think they're doing when they step outside the law or when civil liberties people are upset. And we do this globally as well as domestically. And so it's actually a very interesting space that we occupy because often nobody talks about it, but as the ACLU once said to me, you're the only place we meet the people we sue. And that's actually, to me, like what I wanted to do. And so that's one thing we do. And the other thing we do is we have a series of publications, and the most well-known one came out recently, early this fall. We do it yearly. Now I think we should do it every 5 years. But we keep the only database in the country of all terrorism prosecutions that go on in this here. And so we've started with 9/11, and we've taken it till now. So there's 522 prosecutions, 144 of them are ISIS prosecutions. But you have no idea, if this is what you do 24/7 and put your research students on this every single day for 15 years, how much data you collect. So whenever there's a terrorist attack, we become how many people from Uzbekistan, just basic facts. How many people from Uzbekistan? How many 29-year-olds? How many people were only here 12 years? And actually, the fact is we have all this information just because all we do is we have our students, and it's very student-driven and has rotating students over all these years, is input all the information from the criminal indictments. And then what I do is I go to the trials and I watch them, and I comment on the other end, which is what's different about these trials, what's the same about these trials. And so I've gotten a very large perspective on what goes on and where this line is between crime and war, which is where I think the country is standing right now, and what's being debated through tweets and other ways, which is what is crime and what is war. And you know what? As much as I have my own political opinions, I actually might be able to argue either side. It's just that pick a side, and we picked a side. So this is what I want to talk to you about. So, and I want to ask somebody else. How many of you were under 12 on 9/11? That's so unfortunate. Really? Wow. So let me ask you this other question. If I said to you, if I were like your professor and I said to you, and I asked you the question, but I'm going to give you the answer, and I said to you, what was the first historical memory you had? Would any of you say 9/11? One? Okay, good. That's interesting. That's kind of interesting. A lot of my students are from New York, so it's a little bit different. But I think it matters. I think how you value, view, and understand 9/11 really matters on where it was in terms of where you lived and how old you are. So I'm speaking to those of you who don't have it as your first historical memory and trying to make the point, as you'll see, that this country fundamentally changed after 9/11 and how. So on 9/11, the immediate reaction, as it should have been, was for the officials in Washington and all of those who had some kind of knowledge of al-Qaeda to get themselves down to Washington to try to figure out, they knew right away it was al-Qaeda, to try to figure out what to do after these 4 planes took out the trade centers, tried to take out the Pentagon, and perhaps the 4th was, and I think most likely, headed for the White House, but crashed in a field in Pennsylvania. And within 6 weeks, the Congress had passed the very lengthy Patriot Act, as I'm sure you know. The president had issued a number of executive orders, and there were others underway. But in addition to the executive orders and the Patriot Act, there were a number of things that went on secretly. legal memos that came out of the Department of Justice. And so by the time Thanksgiving happened, this country had two systems of justice going on at the same time, one that they told us about and one that they didn't tell us about. And the reason was that in order to keep us safe, the reason in their minds was that in order to keep us safe, the laws that we had would not protect us. And so therefore, nipping and tucking at some and getting rid of others, they believed it. This wasn't, we're going to do bad things on purpose. It was, we're going to take care of this country because something went wrong. And whatever we have to do, whatever we were doing before, we didn't do it right. I would agree with that. So interestingly enough, the Patriot Act was drafted within 10 days. Now, there is no legislation of that size and that magnitude that's drafted that fast. Why was it drafted in 10 days? It was drafted because it was taken from a number of proposals that individuals in government, in the executive, in the Department of Justice, in the FBI, which is part of the Department of Justice, had on their minds for a long time. And they had to do with the relationship between mostly the relationship between intelligence and law enforcement powers. And so the Patriot Act got passed very quickly because it was already written. It was sort of compiled from a lot of different sources. And it had in it things that would eventually lead to trouble, which I'm going to talk about. At the same time, and this is very important to today's news, the White House drafted on the evening of September 11th an authorization for military force against the enemies. The original authorization of military force was submitted to Congress in the same kind of short form, something like 300 words, except it had something in it that the current authorization for the use of military force does not have. It had in it, in addition to the ability to use our powers against those who committed the acts of 9/11 and those who are harboring them or supporting them in any way, it had the authority for the president to use these same powers against anyone he deemed to be an enemy of the United States. And believe it or not, after 9/11, our Congress did not allow that to pass. Now, there wasn't a lot of opposition. There was enough that they had to curtail it, and they pulled it back so a few days later, when the authorization for the use of military force, which is still in effect today and has not been amended, it has not been amended on paper, but has been amended actually, when it was passed, it only gave the president the power to use the force of the United States government for the purpose of punishing al-Qaeda, the Taliban, and those who had contributed in one way or another to 9/11. So, and I bring that up because, as you know, and I'm going to talk about at the end, there's a big debate going on right now about the authorization for the use of military force. There's been a debate all along, but there's a very live debate right now. And I'll talk about that when I get there. The second thing that happened was that in the Patriot Act, something that I'm sure you know about, I hate to be so technical, but it was called Section 215. And in Section 215 is what Edward Snowden revealed as the metadata program, in which you could figure out from, how long a call was, where it was from, where it was to, and other data points. Basically, it was a way of figuring out who was talking to who, and in terms of our intelligence services, guessing what they were talking about, depending on sequence of calls. Was another authority that was new and that law enforcement had wanted for a long time. And another thing that happened in the Patriot Act was what became the evisceration of the line between law enforcement and intelligence. Whereas in the 1970s, 80s, 90s of the last century, it had been sort of a cause of honor for law enforcement intelligence to say that they would not share things except in very limited ways that were prescribed by law. And the conclusion after 9/11 was no. The intelligence people and the law enforcement people have to be on the same page. They have to know the information in relatively the same time, and they have to be able to use it because they can use it to protect us, not just to prosecute people in our courts. I may or may not I will get back to that. The other thing that happened right after 9/11 was an executive order that said that anybody who was detained and held in U.S. Custody from the battlefield, basically following from the authorization for the use of military force, would be kept in military detention. This is a road that once we went down, we've never been able to get out. It was called a military order. Nobody in the military that I've talked to or that's weighed in with any other writer was involved. And it was based on an order that Franklin Delano Roosevelt had crafted, in fact. The only thing is that in Franklin Delano Roosevelt's order, the courts were involved. The Attorney General was one of the people with oversight, and a number of other officials. In this order, it was basically that you detain them, they go into military custody. Essentially, they are what became known as enemy combatants. And this became the basis for Guantanamo. At the same time that this was going on, three other things happened. On September 17th, President Bush wrote somehow a secret order that actually we didn't see till maybe 3 years ago, authorizing a different kind of policy towards the law, both in terms of surveillance and some things in terms of torture. I actually haven't seen that document, but he also, in this military order, laid out a sense of what the military commissions would be. So by the time Thanksgiving happened, this country was in a very different place. And the fact was, civil libertarians and others were reacting to the Section 215 I talked about in the Patriot Act. They were reacting to what they had seen in the Patriot Act of the wall between intelligence and law enforcement coming down. They reacted to something I didn't mention, which was the roundup of individuals who were Muslims who they were worried about might want to commit an attack on the country. But the framework was in place, and that framework has lasted in some way, shape, or form until this very day. And the way you know that is because of what happened in the last 2 days in New York and Washington. And the framework created the following. It created state-sponsored torture. It created a detention system that allowed for detention without trial, without charge, and without release, which is Guantanamo. It created a surveillance state in which people were surveilled in a way that was fundamentally outside of the law, and it created, that's enough. And so there was one other thing. I'll leave it at that. And so so what I have done over the past 15 years, and what this book is about, is studying the trajectory of each one of these things: indefinite detention, torture, surveillance, and one other, which I will mention during Obama, which is targeted killings, which did not exist during the Bush era. What's interesting about this entire period of time is that how did you expect a country to react after 9/11? How did you expect a country being attacked for the first time on its mainland in its history, 3,000 people dying? What did you expect? And so in a way, for all of those critics who say this shouldn't have happened, I actually take a different approach, which is it's completely and utterly understandable. And I have interviewed the people who wrote the Patriot Act, the people who wrote the memos of the Department of Justice, and the officials who have had to implement them. And whenever they're talking about this first period of time, I'm kind of inside their heads. And I think that it makes, I wish we had done it differently, but it makes sense that this is how they did it. In January, Guantanamo Bay opened and got its first tranche of 20 prisoners, and within weeks had 300 prisoners, ultimately had 800. By the spring of that year, you had the first detainees in custody that went to black sites that the Bush administration thought that they would and did torture. All of this was premised on a couple of legal and constitutional assumptions and principles. And I could go through them, but I'll tell you the most important one because it's relevant today. The most important one was the commander-in-chief powers and the powers of the President of the United States. And what these legal memos written inside the Justice Department that were secret, that talked about the right to surveillance, warrantless surveillance against Americans, which breaks the Fourth Amendment, the lack of a right to due process, which breaks the Fifth Amendment, the need to have individuals held indefinitely in detention, and the necessity to torture. Was that the president, under these times of emergency, needed to have whatever powers he wanted and whatever powers he needed, and that there were no checks on those powers. And if keeping it secret had to be what made no checks on those powers, then that would be kept secret. But the premise of all of this, written by a not-so-young man anymore, who's now a law professor at Berkeley, John Yoo, was that the president had commander-in-chief powers, it was a time of war, and that this, in fact, was the way to go forward and would make the country safe. And so, in a kind of very unfortunate way, it was the Department of Justice that authorized so much of what went on. And I'll just give you a little example of why this gets into such an unusual place, which is that in August, when we already had in custody, the United States had in custody a person that had already started to torture and wanted to make sure it was okay, the Central Intelligence Agency went to the Department of Justice and said, here's what we'd like to do. These things are illegal, you know. And it's a whole bunch of techniques which you may or may not have read about, that I'm sure you've read about: waterboarding, which is simulated drowning. There's another thing called walling, where you smash somebody's head against the wall. There are all different ways of being shackled. There was being, buried alive in a coffin. There was subjected to hot and cold, sleep deprivation. And so the CIA, in memos that later became available, wrote to the Justice Department lawyers and said, "Can you look over these? Could you please look over these techniques and tell us which one of these you think are legal?" Now imagine. And so the lawyer at the Office of Legal Counsel looked at them, and I actually think that if I had been at the CIA, what I would have expected back is no, and I'm not sure that wasn't what they expected. But the Department of Justice did not say no. They said no to a couple of techniques, mock execution, for example, but they did not say no. And so it was all of a sudden open season on what Americans wanted to do and could do. And what the result of that eventually was that the FBI, in the process of interrogating individuals in these other third countries, pulled back, pulled all their men out, pulled all their officers out, because they didn't want to be involved in torture, which just made it more open season for the Central Intelligence Agency to, and we can get into that in question and answers if you wanted to. So in my scenario of we understand what happened after 9/11, here's where we stop understanding what happened after 9/11. In December of 2003, after all of these things had been implemented and put in place in rather strong ways. Guantanamo was up and running. It was already had the harsh techniques that we later came to identify with it. The torture program had been authorized and was underway. Surveillance authorities were in place. A lawyer, who's now at Harvard, by the name of Jack Goldsmith, came into the Department of Justice. And somebody there who had been looking at everything that was going on from the beginning and knew about the memos said to him, they were friends, I'd like to show you a few things. And so Goldsmith did a deep dive into these memos and discovered one after another this arcane interpretation of presidential powers that left out of the memos, and I'm not going to go into all the legal details, but the most important case on record defining presidential powers, just ignored it, which said basically that if Congress has passed something and the president wants to do something opposing that or anathema to that, he can't do it. That's when his power's at its lowest. Just left that out. And he looked at this, and as almost anybody would have, said, no, we can't do this. And so he looked around for allies, and the person he went to as an ally was Jim Comey, who later became the head of the FBI, and as you know, was summarily dismissed as the head of the FBI. And he went to Comey, who was a well-known prosecutor, somebody who knew the FBI very well, as well as the courts very well, and he said, I think we better do something about this. And together, largely with Comey fronting it, being the quarterback, they tried to convince the White House, where much of this had originated, the suggestions for this, that they needed to stop certain things. One of them was torture, and one of them was warrantless surveillance on Americans that weren't supposed to be surveilled. And to a large extent, that began a process of reform that went a variety of ways. Some of the programs ended. Some of the programs went back to the institutional home they should have had. So that home may have been classified as it was with surveillance authorities, but still it was recognizable. And some of them, including surveillance authorities, eventually, over the course of years, made their way into new laws so that they were authorized. And maybe they were authorized in a different way, but at least they were legal. But Jack Goldsmith, 9 months after he came into office, left. For reasons that we can only surmise, to spend time with his family. And that is where I think the problems with this entire conversation begin. It's not on 9/11. It's not in the first 6 months or year after 9/11. It's when they recognized the problem in a transparent and open way and didn't fix them. And once you've done that, you begin to, just like all humans do, you begin to try to justify what you're doing and trying to make it work and make it seem right and be defensive about it. And we lived in that limbo for quite a while. At least 2 years before George Bush left office, he did a number of things to change the course of events. He wanted Guantanamo to close and went on record in saying that. He let 524 people out of Guantanamo, of the total of 800. He meant it. They had the wrong people. They knew it. They sent them home. They appointed somebody to help transfer these detainees to a variety of different countries. They stopped torturing people in the torture program as we knew it, transferred them to Guantanamo Bay. This was not just new to Obama. Obama was the person who carried this story the furthest, but it started in the Bush administration with these officials. When Obama came into office, he made it his business, as you probably know, on day one, even if you weren't here for 9/11, you had to have been here for Obama and be sitting in this room, that he was going to end torture, he was going to close Guantanamo, he was going to make transparency a big part of his administration, and it sort of symbolized a sense that what had happened after 9/11, if it didn't end with Jack Goldsmith and Jim Comey, was going to end now. And he was naive, to put it mildly. In retrospect, if you're going to close Guantanamo, close it and then tell us. I mean, move the people to the United States. Now Guantanamo is not closable in any way that anybody can discern for a variety of reasons. One of them, a congressional ban against moving any of the detainees to this country for trial or anything else. So that was the moment. The moment was missed. And we've been sort of living out the consequences of that since then. Obama tried, and he tried in a number of very interesting ways and made some headway, and I'll tell you what headway he made. He got 200 people out of Guantanamo. There's only 41 left. There were 5 that a board had cleared for release. They didn't get out, but at least he tried. I have to give him credit. I think he really wanted to do it. The Patriot Act sunsetted under President Obama. It did not sunset because of him. And the reason it sunsetted was the surveillance authority that was declared illegal by a court, the Second Circuit Court of Appeals. When it was declared illegal, this metadata program that I talked about, Congress let the Patriot Act go and passed what is now called the Freedom Act. But the difference is really in the surveillance program. That, too, ended under Obama. Torture, I've already said, ended under Obama. But what did not end under Obama was what began under Obama, which was the use of targeted killings. And the use of targeted killings to kill terrorists around the world in a way that would identify individuals or groups of individuals and, in theory, kill fewer people, commit fewer troops to the ground. This was a president that wanted to pull his troops out of war, and did. Not as much as he wanted, but he did. And this targeted killing program, sometimes called the drone program, was sort of the balance sheet for Obama. He may have been convinced about these other civil liberties abuses and constitutional questions, but he was convinced on the drone policy that it was more humane, that it could be done in a rational and logical way. And who was going to decide who got killed? The executive, the president, and his national security advisors. And was there going to be a court trial over it? No, didn't have to be there wasn't. And why were we sure this would work and kill the right people and be done in the right way? Because we could trust our government. because we had a good president, and he was, in their minds, we had a good president, he was surrounded by good law-abiding folks. And the surveillance policy became sort of for civil libertarians, the nightmare policy of the Obama years, sort of his version of what went on before. And again, where did it begin? With law memos written in the Office of Legal Counsel and the Department of Justice. And how did they justify it? Was it on presidential powers? Not necessarily. It was on international law powers. The one body of law that the Bush administration really never wanted to talk about was international law, on the grounds that it diminished the sovereignty of the government. But the Obama administration took on international law and said, you know what? These follow the laws of international law, and reasoned through it. And as you know, I'm sure, killed a few Americans, only one of whom they admit to targeting. But still, no trial, no. So you can see how these policies wrap around one another. And one of the central pieces of the targeted killing program, which ramped up so intensely under President Obama, was the authorization for the use of military force. Because during the early months of the Obama administration, the administration, in legal papers and in discourse, began to use the word "and associated forces." And Al-Qaeda and associated forces. Al-Qaeda, these terrorist groups, and associated forces. So what is an associated force? This is not a legal term. This is not a political science term. What is an associated force? So it became somebody who's associated with Al-Qaeda is what it had to be. Well, who's affiliated with Al-Qaeda? Does ISIS count when they say that Al-Qaeda and they are enemies? Is that, even though they grew out of AQAP, is that associated? What about Al-Shabaab in Somalia? Is that associated with? What about Al-Nusra in Syria? Are they all, if they're jihadis, does that make them associated in theory? The answer is there was no answer, and therefore it could be as broadly applied as you want. And so when Obama left office, you had Guantanamo still open, no accountability for torture, something I haven't really gone into and that is important. You know, there were all these civil libertarians that were saying, you should, we should have public officials be accountable. And Obama said in the very beginning, no, we're going to look forward. We're not going to look back. We're not going to have a witch hunt. We're not going to start bringing public officials in here, raking them over the coals, sending them to jail. It's just turning up a lot of bad stuff. We're moving on. And you know, he left the head of the Pentagon in place when he took office, Secretary of Defense, and he left a number of other people in place. And so to actually go after this would have been to go after major institutions in the country, the CIA, the Pentagon, and a number of other intelligence agencies. And he decided to forgo it. And believe me, it would have been a mess and a hassle. But because he didn't do it, it's not inconceivable that you could have state-sponsored torture again, because there's no accountability for it. There's no punishment for it. So that stayed on the books. So as much as I like a lot of things about President Obama and what he stood for, and particularly in regards to his attempts to move away from the prior administration, an awful lot of the structure, an awful lot of the rhetoric, and awful lot of the realities legally of the Bush years, or enough of them, if not a lot, were still in place when it came to Donald Trump coming to office. And I want to talk about this a little bit, and then I want to talk about what's going on right now, because I think for somebody like me, it's like, wait a minute, I went through that. Somebody else should have to do this time. I don't want to have to answer the phone every 5 minutes like, whoa. So I'm going to give you a sequence of events, all of which you know about, but I want to lay them out for you. And then if I have time, there's one more thing I want to talk about that dovetails with this. Well, the first thing is that during the election, Guantanamo and torture were talked about repeatedly during the campaign season. Torture was talked about by a number of Trump associates, by Trump and by others, as something that we should consider turning to. These terrorists are doing us harm. They're growing in numbers. They're much more dangerous because they're lone wolves rather than organized networks. And so we need to do this. The second thing that happened when Trump came into office, or on the wave of his coming in, was talking about Guantanamo. Guantanamo has not taken a new prisoner since 2008. As I told you, between them, Bush and Obama, and mostly Bush, got rid of more than 700 of the prisoners. The idea of opening Guantanamo, which has been such a success in terms of our relationships with the world, but also our sense of self and how we're able to process prisoners and articulate our laws, is really kind of an irresponsible attitude. At the same time, keeping Guantanamo open triggers in a number of individuals, including myself, references to the military commissions. The military commissions were established first by Bush and then under a new act by Obama to try enemy combatants. And among those we're trying to try now are individuals who perpetrated 9/11. It's shameful and it's harmful that this country has not tried the individuals in custody for over a decade, and some of them more, who brought about 9/11. And if I were a psychiatrist, which I'm not, I would be able to draw lines in which having to live as victims of this kind of tragic violence without any kind of redress or justice is harmful. And the victims are not just the family members of the 3,000 people killed. It's all of us. And I think it's had a number of outcomes that we don't read as outcomes of that, but are. And so that's one basket of things. Then 4 weeks ago, in Syria, an American citizen was found to be fighting alongside ISIS, reportedly. And he was brought into U.S. custody, and he was labeled an enemy combatant. Now, what is an enemy combatant? An enemy combatant in the 9/11 period is somebody who goes to Guantanamo. That's basically what it is, or gets tried by military commissions. An enemy combatant is somebody who does not fit into any of the legal systems that we understand as binding: international law, domestic law, or military law. We haven't used the term. Obama declared that we would not use the term anymore during his early years in office. But now we have our first enemy combatant, and it's very much a challenge to the lawyers in the country. Are you going to let there be another enemy combatant? Are you going to let this kind of civil liberties be overrun? And then, as you know, we had this terrorist attack 2 days ago in New York. So it's the first lethal terrorist attack since 9/11. 8 people died, more than a dozen were injured. It was by a Muslim man who was 29 years old, who'd been in the country for 12 years. And the first thing that happens inside the halls of Washington and the White House is to declare this person an enemy combatant. Why is this important? Because if you put together the individual captured in Syria and you put together the person captured on U.S. soil, you have 2 categories of people who never, not under Bush and not under Obama, would ever have been put in Guantanamo Bay. U.S. citizens don't go to Guantanamo Bay, and people apprehended on U.S. soil have never gone to Guantanamo Bay. It doesn't happen. So in one fell swoop, in a very short period of time, this administration let it be known that really there was another kind of criminal justice for these kinds of people. Okay, so now I want to just step back for a minute and have you realize that now we have the AUMF, which is now in play, is everybody, and they want to return to the now draft language for the AUMF resembles exactly what came out of the White House on that first night. There's a call there was just new surveillance powers granted, I don't know if anybody noticed, which is contrary to any of the things that were done publicly or lawfully before. There's been obviously persistent talk about torture, and there's talk about reopening Guantanamo Bay and changing a lawful detention system. In addition to all of this, yesterday, the top defense attorney at Guantanamo was held in contempt, arrested, and put in custody. Why? That's the hearing that's going on now, by the way, that you're making me miss. Because he said it was okay for the defense team to quit over classified improprieties. And what you need to know about that is that so many bad things have happened at Guantanamo Bay that no one can figure out what this is all about. Like, they didn't respond before. They didn't quit. They didn't quit when the CIA was listening to them in the courtroom and that was found out. They didn't quit when the defense papers were found on the prosecutor's computers. They didn't quit when they found out that there was a translator in the room that had translated at the black sites during the torture sessions. They didn't quit when they found that there were informants trying to spy on them when they were having meetings with their clients. They didn't quit when they found detectors in the room that were listening to their meetings with their clients. So nobody knows what this is, and every journalist in the whole world is trying to find out two things. One, what this is all about, and two, what happened at Guantanamo Bay in this particular case, and two, what the name of the enemy combatant who was detained in Syria, the American, was, because they will not tell anybody. So in a way, for those of us who followed the Bush years, it's like we're tired. It's like we've already been through this. We know how this plays out. It plays out very poorly. It'll eventually, we think, get righted, but we're in a very dire situation all over again. So I just wanted to mention one other thing that is a parallel event that nobody ever talks about, that I think is interesting, and I think where a lot of these things can be resolved. And that is that all the time that these controversies are going on, all the time that these things are being litigated in the headlines as well as in some of the courts, you know what's happening? 522 terrorists, alleged terrorists, are being taken to court in every state in the country and tried before a jury, many of them. Some of them plead out with a defense team and a prosecutor and a judge. And this happens whether they are convicted of smaller crimes or whether they're convicted of attempted murder. And so all the time that these sort of extra legal nips and tucks and legal limbos are being developed, what's really happening is that the judicial system has been trying its best to prove and show that it has a viable way to handle much of this, namely counterterrorism measures, by arresting individuals, by putting them through the process of being indicted, by allowing them to plea or go to trial, by resolving their cases. In terrorism cases, they're usually convicted, and by moving on. And so this month, and nobody cares. And I'll tell you how I know that nobody cares, which is fine, because maybe it's good that it goes on like this and nobody's making much headway about it. I'll tell you why it's interesting. So, remember Benghazi? Remember that guy, the Christopher Stevens? Okay, so the alleged Benghazi mastermind, who says he's not the mastermind, but Abu Khatala, is on trial right now. Did you know that? He's in trial in D.C. in a case that's, I think, about to wind down. And there's not a lot of press coverage of it. There's not a lot of interest in it. At the same time, do you remember in New York a couple of years ago, there was the Chelsea bomber who also tried to set off bombs in New Jersey? Didn't kill anybody, but 4 bombs are 4 bombs. He was convicted 2 weeks ago in federal court in New York. That should also be registered as a big trial and a big accomplishment, right, for American, not just jurisprudence, but American counterterrorism and American ability to do something in a recognizably lawful way without making exceptions. There are a number of other terrorism trials of lesser ilk that just concluded last month, and there are a number of new ones that are about to start. So I think that is the backdrop to what happened yesterday. When all of a sudden you woke up in the morning and the President of the United States said, we can't use our courts for this guy, we're going to yank him out of the court system, we're going to make him an enemy combatant, basically we're going to bring him into the military commissions, which don't work. The military missions don't work. Since whenever you want to date it to 2002, 2006, 2009, 2017, we really have been unable to do the most important trials to the nation, the 9/11 trial, and the case that's at issue with these defense team that's quit, the al-Nashiri case. So all of a sudden, the idea of military commissions was back again with the exact same language from the old days. It's not going to work. It's not going to be fast. It's fast? I don't think the military commissions are faster, I'm pretty sure. And I noticed that Attorney General Sessions came out with this today. And I think ultimately what this teaches us is that the only way out of this conundrum in this debate is not to play nice guy. It wasn't okay not to have accountability for the things that were illegal and unlawful. And I'm not saying what that accountability had to be. No, I'm not. But there had to be more of a public display of this was wrong. And we haven't had it. And as a result, I do have this feeling that we're kind of sliding back into this sort of loop, that some of the things that I'm saying and that my colleagues are saying and that the lawyers in the courtroom are saying, at the court paper saying, are just reiterations. We could just take out our old notes and use them again. And so I really wonder if this is just the cycle of that we're going to be in forever, or what's going to happen. And I just want to end by saying one thing. This is all very interesting, to somebody who's in the weeds of it like I am. But when 9/11 happened, the first thing that happened was that the lawyers in the country and the politicians and the foreign policy experts decided to call our enemy non-state actors. These were non-state actors. These were transnational bad guys with an ideology that motivated them, with a hierarchical structure that was organized and powerful and armed and trained. And for years, that is how our national security system has thought about this. And in the process, it has turned a lot of our intelligence resources and talent, a lot of our court focus, and many other things to this issue of non-state actors. But guess what? Read your New York Times today. There may have been a terrorist attack in New York yesterday or 2 days ago, but now we're dealing with non-state actors and with major powers all around the world as potential enemies. And so I wanted this to be a happy speech, but when you asked me to do it, it would have had a different ending. It's not my fault. So, but what I'm trying to say is that the complexities of the world we live in we're not going to simplify them, and we don't want to simplify them. We as a country want to be able to take on state actors and non-state actors. We want to be able to deal with prisoners that we get in a way that makes us safer. We want to be able to have the kind of intelligence that will make us safer. But in the long run, what we really want to do is stay who we are. And so in homage to that, I just wanted to give you this little coda, and then I have to be quiet, I know. This little coda, which is this. It's because it fascinated me when I finally realized it, which is that Guantanamo Bay had 800 individuals in it, and it turned out that after 2 administrations and tremendous amount of review, the same 36, it's really 36 people because 5 were cleared for release, that the Obama administration originally said there are 36 people here that we really think are bad guys. And, we would have liked them to be tried, but Obama administration, after all these reviews, agreed. But the original idea was just get whoever you can. This was an intelligence failure, get as much as you can, and that's going to make us safer, right? The same thing with surveillance. The idea that more and more and more of more and more and more people is a way to target, to focus, to individualize, to know what really your enemy is, I'm not sure that's a rational conclusion. And so I think I wish the ultimate lesson from all of this would have been that when the founders got together and decided what should be in the Constitution, the things that they wrote in, which sound like ethical and moral and anti-monarchical principles about search and seizure and about free speech, really were about something additional to what the words on the paper say. In terms of guilt and innocence, they were about specificity. If you look at the way the Constitution and the laws that come out of it are construed, it's important to know who the criminal is or who the enemy is in the specific, not in the general. And is that will keep you safe. And so it's always been sort of interesting to me that for all the other things that we talk about the Founding Fathers and the creation of the Constitution, that takeaway, when you project it onto the future and to today, it's the same thing. It's not more, it's smarter. it's more targeted. And that's what I think our intelligence services have learned over all this time. I think it's what our law enforcement people know. I think they've worked excessively hard to try to restore a lot of these principles. But I think that the future is very much in doubt. So I know you want me to stop. I'm stopping. So that's it.
All right, we'll take a very quick break. Anyone who needs to leave or grab another cup of coffee, we'll be back with the Q&A in less than a minute. Well, maybe a minute.
Well, displayed nicely. You can even see the tail end.
I would definitely call it.
Either way, yeah.
That's funny. So that's still going on. It's more than 10 seconds.
I'll try to pass that along. I mean, I will pass it along, whether there'll be any resolution. No, I know the person to contact, and I'll do it. He's John Gilliam, Dean's office.
20 more to say.
But, yeah.
I had to get to today.
No.
I actually.
And at one point, the lectures were missing the semester, and tables were missing, so various pieces of furniture were missing from the room. And John Gilliam was the person I was supposed to talk that to, and I guess then it showed up eventually. So what's falling apart on it? What room is it? Okay, yeah, that's true, doesn't it? I mean, occasionally.
All right, we are back in action. And I guess we even have the first question. Or two.
You use the term torture throughout your lecture, but I would really like to hear you define it, because in my opinion, torture is a subjective, slippery term, and it very much depends on who you ask. And I realize that might
It's a good question.
Scope of your presentation, but I'd be curious to hear what your definition of the word torture.
I think it's an excellent question, and I want to tell you that if I were in Washington, that'd be the first question I got, and they wouldn't have asked. They wouldn't have asked like that. They would have said, "It's not torture; it's enhanced interrogation," which I go out of my way. And you're right. I could have said EITs, which I really don't like. More than enhanced interrogation, I don't like this EIT thing. And you're right. When I did the torture papers, it was the first book in the United States published with the word torture in it, and it wasn't published by an American press. It was published by Cambridge Press, and even then, it had to go all the way to the head of the university, not the publishing house. And then what's the big deal? Okay, so torture, and I love. Help me, get this better. But I think torture is physical or psychological abuse for the purpose of getting information, allegedly for the purpose of getting information.
So, for instance, how does that differ from what a common law enforcement officer might do with a suspect that they've detained and they're questioning and they're, keeping them in the room and they're talking about them and, they have their right to contact their lawyer, but they're not necessarily advertising him. Couldn't that be construed as psychological torture?
Let me add a phrase. Good. No, because I will add a phrase, which is that will cause significant bodily or psychological harm, which I left out. And you're right, I should have said that. I like this. No, exactly. But like somebody recently said to me, but what about solitary confinement? Is that torture? And the answer is yes. And so you're absolutely right. There's some kind of slope here, but it's different when you're, at least in my mind, and I don't like any of it, to tell you the truth. But when you're in a situation where there are no controls at all, if somebody dies in custody in a prison, it's a big deal. If somebody dies in a black site and nowhere because they're being tortured to death, nobody knows. There's no accountability for it. There's no standards. Let me tell you something else. There's something else about torture, which is not the reason I'm opposed to it, but this is like my well, if I have to be, give some kind of national security reason. This is the thing that strategically bothers me about torture is that if you think that you can get information out of somebody by punching them, let's just take something easy, just by punching them, which I think would work with me, and a lot of people I know, we're not trained for that. You're not doing your homework on the ground. If we wait till the torture is always tied to what's next, not what's in 3 years. It's what's next. You gotta want your intelligence services to be on the ground doing the work they need to do for getting this right way ahead of time. And there's too many times, and it's not necessarily, it's hard, it's not like it's easy to do this, but there's too many times, whether it's the Arab Spring or things that have happened in Iran or things that have happened in Iraq or the creation of ISIS. Like all of a sudden we open, so I don't like, it sort of makes me a little uncomfortable that so much of this has lain on it's ineffective. Because I know the torture report, when we've read, the 500 pages of it that we have from Senator Dianne Feinstein's committee, and they did a lot of work, and it's tremendous documentation. But the takeaway isn't just that it doesn't work, or that it didn't contribute to helping us find out things, because there are things we know that we found out through certain torture things, enhanced interrogation events. I'll do that for this. But it's just not overall a good way to go about things. And it always amazed me. I once wrote this piece things like a billion years ago. I went to a bunch of torture museums, like they have them in Eastern Europe. Yeah, and in Japan. But at first I didn't know it. I mean, it just sort of became a habit that I didn't know I was going to have, because the first time I went, there wasn't torture. But anyway, I went to them and I started noticing how similar they were to what they did. Like in Prague, the middle of the floor is this waterboard thing, like the bucket, and they're showing this waterboard. And I'm like, what? And the same thing with the short shackling. It's out of some medieval textbook, for some, bad thing that's prisoner happening. And so I was like, how is it possible that we're in the 21st century talking about all this high-end warfare and all this new way of being in the world and what all this technology means, and what we go for is something that's physical and tangible and literally 4 centuries old in terms of, how we've had it. And I think that part of it warrants a lot of thought about just what torture really was about, which was being so unhinged that it was a way of sort of grappling with basic human confrontation, which is, I think, very different than why we started the program. So, is that?
That's a great answer.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
As you were giving your presentation, I couldn't help but think of Mary Debziak's book, Wartime. And it's a very simple question, but I was just wondering what your thoughts were on some of her arguments.
I like her, but tell me exactly what, and we've done a couple of panels together, like what you're thinking of.
More so just, she talks about how, one of the ideas that pops into my mind is that we're in this new type of period where we don't know when this war on terror is going to end, so there's certain laws and certain things that don't have a finality to them, and so I don't know, I was just curious how...
So the idea of the forever war and what that means for... Okay. So first of all, I think this war is going to end. I don't buy that for 1 second. I think it's... I was thinking the other day, so there was a certain point during the Obama presidency when all of a sudden the term manage, it might even have been at the end of Obama, we're going to manage this war. The war on terror is going to manage, and it's just going to be something that goes along like organized crime or arms trafficking, and we're going to manage it, and we're going to... Now that may be where it ends up, but the idea of this global war on terror that we started with, are we going to have terrorists forever? Yeah, we might not always call them terrorists. We are going to have some kind of organized crime forever. We have so encouraged this idea of war, and I'm not really sure why. This is why I'm always bringing it back to the criminal justice system, which is just only a piece of it, but it's an important piece of it. I think the bigger question is, does the United States always want to be in a state of war? I grew up in a generation where, in theory, there were no wars, right? Post-Vietnam War, what wars were there? There were wars we didn't know about. They didn't tell us about them, but it wasn't the same thing. We have been in perpetual war now for a long time. And is this going to become the state of affairs? And if it is, to your question, do we need what some academics call this state of exception. Do we need to, live inside this state of exception that all these philosophically minded political theorists talk about? And I hope not. I really hope not. And I think good leadership and just a little bit of kindness. I mean, we're so mean to each other. Just a little bit of kindness could go, I know that sounds very naive, but no. But it's just this idea where the first thing we're supposed to do is figure out who we don't like and how we can harm them is probably not the best starting point. So yeah, so I reject that forever war thing.
So your talk dwells in many ways on the differences of opinion or analysis of policy decisions or legal arguments. And I was wondering if you could talk about, in many ways, there seems to be sort of an underlying theme in your talk about the kind of tension between the executive and the legislative, right? So correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems in many ways that the legislative has, to some extent, willingly abdicated some of these responsibilities to the executive for reasons of political expediency, or they realize that these problems are in many ways either intractable or very difficult to solve, and they're politically costly, right? So they're in many ways seem to be outsourcing these kind of dirty jobs to the executive, where you have intermittent kind of congressional hearings on torture and sorts of things, but nothing fundamentally changes. So I was wondering if you could sort of talk to that dynamic and where you see that going potentially.
I mean, that's a really good statement of the reason people would support executive power isn't just he needs these powers, and then we don't have to be responsible. That's kind of like you're suggesting now, right? And it's really true that Congress went out of its way on innumerable occasions to not weigh in. There's a guy who wrote the drone memos by the name of David Barron. He's a federal judge now in Massachusetts, and he wrote a book called Waging War about conflicts between the president and Congress, taking it up to the president, but not quite taking it up to, you know what I'm saying? But it's been what you're saying is sort of been this, and it's a really good book, this kind of tension constantly starting, in the first days of the Republic and lasting up till now. But this has been unusual, and it's been unusual in part because of the role of the courts. The courts also, I didn't talk about that. That's a large part of my book, but I don't talk about it here. The courts, on numerous occasions, when it came to surveillance, except that last decision that ended up sunsetting the Patriot Act, just said, this is national security. We're not going to go there. And if the district court didn't say it, the appellate court did say it. And people miss that because the Supreme Court had these few harsh rulings about detainees and how they had to have habeas rights. And so it became like, well, look what the courts are doing, but actually not. On all these other ways, the courts time and time again said, not us. And I hate to say we don't want the responsibility, but in a way, and it's what I fear now, right now, which is, who's going to take this on? But yeah, I'm going to incorporate that into what I said. You go ahead.
Let's get back to the old definitions thing. I know you really.
That's fine. I have a dictionary right under.
So, terrorism. What is terrorism?
Oh, I don't know what terrorism.
So people are running each other over or running other people over with drugs.
Okay.
What's
okay. So this is such a timely question, and in fact, I could have given the whole talk on this. So, so there's like 3 parts of an answer to that. One is, if you go to a European conference to talk about counterterrorism, you'd be lucky if you get beyond what's the definition of terrorism. It consumes and has consumed people elsewhere in the world for decades. Is it Basque separatists? Is it Irish? What is a terrorist? Is it somebody? But basically, it's somebody with a political agenda who thinks by acts of violence it can cause some kind of change. Usually, some kind of change. That would be the simplest definition of terrorism. In this country, terrorism is attached primarily to international players. And the reason that's an interesting question, and this is kind of the piece of it, is that you raise the question of, so there was this cartoon, which I put in a recent piece I wrote for NBC. And I don't know, I referred to it, but they somehow then found it, which I thought was awesome. So it's in the piece, looks like I'm a cartoonist, right? And they have these 2 wolves, and one's white and one's dark. And under the white one, it says, lone wolf, whatever, criminal, and on the other one it says terrorist, you know? And so what's your definition of a terrorist? For a long time now, civil libertarians and others totally understandably have said, you can't just say when a guy goes into look, Timothy McVeigh, you know, blew up the federal building, the Murrah Federal Building, because he was ticked off about many things, but Waco, about the way Waco, it was a political act. And there have been a number of political acts that we have not called that kind of terrorism, or we've prosecuted them, et cetera. The reason this question is really interesting is right now, for the first time in my whole being in this business, there's a lot of vitality between the idea that we should pass a domestic terrorism statute. And I think this is like one of the worst ideas in the whole world, and I totally understand why it comes out of, well, why don't you just call everybody a terrorist? But the problem with the domestic terrorism statute, from my point of view, and you should go read this piece. I don't usually say read my pieces. Like, go read this piece, because I'm very strong. I've been thinking about this for a long time and put together a panel on this for an entire year to sort of think about it and talk about it with people who know a lot more than I do. So I could hear this and we could work through it together, is that the way in which the terrorism statutes were used in the war on terror was with such breadth, and in terms of surveillance powers, in terms of detention powers, that if you start to spread what this is, you have no idea. The terrorism is largely the result, terrorism statute charging is largely the result of being identified, of being accused of being associated with a foreign terrorist organization. So we have a list of foreign terrorist organizations. It's like 64 in this one narrow category. And if you belong to, if you have done something in support of one of those, obviously Al-Qaeda and ISIS, or two, in sort of one of those terrorist organizations, then the following statutes apply, the following terrorism enhancements can apply, etc. Can you imagine what the list of domestic terrorist organizations would be now? What do you actually think would be number one on the list? I'll tell you, it wouldn't be the NRA. What?
Black Lives Matter.
Yeah, that's what people, and there is a very interesting document that I cite in the, that's what I say. And you should see in this article that I cite this document, you should look at an FBI document that came out this summer. It's such an invitation to all the things that really, that civil libertarian advocates would say during the war on terror. And as much as I agreed with everything they'd say, I'd say, no, stop it. That's just overreacting, it's overthinking, so I do not think that's a road we should go down. Look, there's nobody we haven't been able to prosecute and punish and mete out sentences to, whether it's Timothy McVeigh or Dylan Roof or the guy who blew up the kid, well, that didn't matter, but you get what I'm saying. So I think there's enough strength in the legal system as it stands that we can do this, and that we can do this well. But it's a good question. And that way I didn't have to define terrorism. But I didn't.
I'm interested in the military context of your talk. I think it's interesting the way in which some people are defined in the domestic context as sort of, like you were saying, domestic terrorists, versus affiliates of an international organization, people viewed as more of a military threat. I'm interested, are some of these actions justifiable under the banner of military necessity, or how does that martial context affect the story?
So one way it affects the story is an interesting way, and this might, but feel free to follow up. Like okay. So let me actually. There's two things that are coming to mind. One is, that was the original problem. These were military detainees. They should have been put in military custody from the battlefield in Afghanistan, and they should have been declared prisoners of war. Big deal. We would have figured out the whole who gets out, who doesn't get out, why did they get out. But the fact that there was an original intent, we're not giving them the protections of prisoner of war because we need all the tools at our disposal, because the subtext, we don't actually have the tools that we need, and torture is a better tool, or enhanced interrogation is a better tool. So I really wish that we had stayed within that prisoner of war paradigm to begin with, which is within the military confines that you're talking about. The second thing about that is, under the Obama administration, they sort of split the difference between these two things. So they outlawed the term, or got rid of it. Wasn't outlawed. We're not going to declared we're not going to use the term enemy combatant anymore. But notice that when the United States picked up a number of high-value or what they considered important detainees in the war on terror from all over the globe, the first thing they did was put them someplace, not in a black site, nothing like that. They put them on a ship in military custody, and they questioned them. And when they got done, and sometimes it was uncomfortably long, we later found out. And by the way, Katola is one of these guys, the Benghazi guy. And when they got done with that, the expectation was, I think, by the lawyers and the other officials in the Obama administration, their expectation was always, when we're done with talking to them for intelligence value and for what they can tell us about the military battlefield and the intelligence strategies we need, they're going to court. We're going to, when they're not going to Guantanamo, we're going to put them in court and they're going to be tried. So they split the difference. They kept the military context, and they also kept they preserved the law enforcement resolution. There's a fascinating opinion written in the Katola case about this two venue system that it's really worth reading. It's just, you'll see, it's the judge's opinion on, I don't know what it's called, two-tiered interrogation, something. But that would be, so I think there's a way in which they're not mutually exclusive, and I think the Obama administration tried to work its way through that. Yeah. Yeah.
So this is a question that's kind of on the very edge of what you were talking about, especially since you said you weren't a psychologist. But you talked to a lot of these people right at the beginning, and you emphasized the fact that they had seen the world as changing, and that the world is different. And I think from the perspective, the immediate perspective at the time that I had, and I think as you look back on it, is that the world did not change, that they were entirely mistaken. The balance of power between Russia and the United States didn't change, between the United States and China didn't change, between the United States and weak countries didn't change. There was more terrorism, and there has been more terrorism, and that's significant. But from a geopolitical perspective, national security perspective, nothing changed. And so what created this mass hysteria that didn't sort of put this event in a historical context and said that, they basically got really, really lucky to kill so many people. They probably would have normally only killed 50 people, and it was a big accident of a whole bunch of variables that aren't ever going to happen again, at least at this scale. And yet they believed that everything had changed, like everything was thrown out the window.
Yeah, so this is a little, it has to do with what we grew up hearing about who we were in the world. That's the answer to the question is the sense of invulnerability that Americans deeply had about, when I originally wrote this lecture, which was a different lecture, I started with my description of the original thoughts I had on 9/11 and the day after, which I think New Yorkers shared, which was, what exactly did we do wrong? Like, why would anybody want to hurt us? Not just, what's this all about? I think it so knocked us off any self-conception we had. I'm not saying it was a right self-conception, but it's what we had, that we did not have the tools to think about it. On your first premise that nothing has changed, the American position in the world has changed. It has. And I'd leave it to other kinds of scholars to think about what's changed, but I think I do think that China is a different country than it was. I think Russia is a different country than it Russia's again a different country than it was. I think Eastern Europe is vastly different than it was when this whole thing started. And I think that the world is different because of climate change, and it's going to get geographically different and population different. So, but this is not because of 9/11.
That's the point.
Yeah, it's not but what did change was us. I think we changed. I don't know that other things changed, but we definitely, look at, this just makes me so sad, because if you think about bin Laden, what did bin Laden want? He wanted to punish us for who we were, and his malevolent theory was that if he attacked us at our center, everything we represented would unravel. That was the idea. Now, I don't know why it caused so much unraveling, but it has changed our legal way about going a number of things, and it has changed a number of things about the way the amendments are honored or not. Yeah, I think. Yes.
Let's get a
kind of follow-up question a little bit differently. Did you get a sense that the sort of their own personal experience and their own personal history of high-level advisors conditions that fear and that response?
Say that again.
So for example, you have various people in the room who held high offices during the Cold War who had grown out of a kind of a strategy universe in the Cold War era. And I wonder to what extent the experiences they had and the expectations they had on the basis of that kind of conditioned their response to it. This kind of, the thing they were familiar with was essentially a kind of a national security state in operation, right? You had a clear-cut enemy, and then you were groping around in the dark for a decade. And here wasn't attacked.
Yeah, I'm convinced that the structures of diplomacy, intelligence, and other State Department activities that had been set up for the Cold War had not changed by the time of 9/11 happened, that you're absolutely right, and that it harmed us. I do think that has to do with why. I think it's a predicate for why we would turn to unlawful things, because we weren't ready. And it wasn't just in the ways you're talking about. It was also the things we were focused on. Focusing on Russia is not the same thing as focusing on the Arab countries. When they brought these individuals to Guantanamo and they got off the plane, the first plane load, the translators all spoke Arabic. It's like none of the prisoners spoke Arabic. They spoke Pashto or, Pashto or Urdu. Okay, that tells you something. So we did not know enough about this enemy. And that's just one minor example. So I think you're right. We didn't get it. We didn't know how to rethink things in the post-Cold War era. There were a number of people talking about bin Laden, though. There were people talking about what this meant. We just hadn't, I shouldn't say we, I wasn't there. But they just hadn't gotten, they didn't let the intelligence get through quickly enough, the way they should have. That's what happened on 9/11. Or as you say, a million different things could have happened that it's not going to happen again, but yeah. It's hard to explain that to a country. Our politicians could have done that. They could have said, this never should have happened, it's our fault, it's not going to happen again. Instead, they said, this was a natural disaster, this was bound to happen, and now we've been told our lesson, we're going to fix our country in the following ways. On that part, you're very right. And I always wanted to write an essay, terrorism is not a natural disaster. We it doesn't just happen. It's preventable. Anyway, that's what I think.
To ask a follow-up on Professor Trauschweitzer's question then, from a civil and a legal perspective, could you make the same case for something like the Patriot Act or some of these surveillance acts or detention acts where people are sort of reacting to what they perceive to be a new kind of threat and reacting against Cold War notions of who's a prisoner, how do you gather intelligence, how do you deal with domestic?
You mean mimicking it, or do you mean like?
Well, in some ways, I suppose mimicking it, but in other ways, rejecting it and saying we do need these new tools because we have this very old conception of a threat, and our enemy and the person that we are trying to go after does not reflect.
Right. So this has to do a lot with how we defined asymmetry, and so the original thing was, look, this is an asymmetric war, which we didn't think with the Cold War. The Cold War was a symmetric war. We made sure of that, right? Mutually assured destruction, that's very symmetric. So now we're in an asymmetric Cold War, right? And everything we've done could be justified as we're going to re-symmetrize, make symmetric this war, or we're going to have the asymmetry on our side. And so drones, torture, these are symmetry on our side. What's so interesting is when you look at the original detention torture stuff, there's like Colin Powell writes this memo and he says, don't do this. First of all, you're going to get sued. And then he says, but what about the reciprocity thing? If you're in the military, reciprocity is an issue. The way you treat them, they might treat you. And he brings it up. And I was thinking, we never, in this war, and then people bring up the beheadings, but think about it. Torture, you would have expected somewhere the kind of detention. I mean, fascinating to me that kind of, and so I can't answer that, I just noting it. Are you standing there? Because I'm, okay, good.
We have about 10 minutes or so.
Okay, yeah.
You mentioned this in your talk at some place, but I'm really fascinated by this still the interagency tensions and different strategic cultures. Obviously, CIA has a very different background than FBI. So given your research, and since you are really in the middle of these things, so how do you observe these things after 9/11? How did that tension evolve? Where did it go?
So that's interesting. So the first thing was that they recognized there were tensions. And so the first thing was, of course, as I'm sure you know, that the FBI and the CIA were like, oh no, they're not communicating. And of course, years later, the books come out and say, no, that was intentional because the CIA was trying to flip these terrorists. And so it was intentional. It wasn't a lack of, stuff. So, but there was a tremendous amount of, if it wasn't tension, just separateness, or in the words they like to use, bureaucrats like to use, stovepipedness. And so one of the things that emerged during the Bush years, but got extremely strong in the Obama years, was interagency collaboration, and these endless, kinds of meetings that are the interagency. This with the idea that you'll have everybody, all of the equities at the table at the same time. So if you're thinking about droning somebody, you think about what the repercussions are going to be in the country they're droned in, and you're going to think about what the repercussions are going to be for some other arrangement you're trying to make over some, business deal, or you think about all the different equities that are going to be affected by it. Now I'm kind of watching, thinking, I'm not sure this same interagency thing is gonna last. I think I can, you could, like, look what's happening to the State Department. Like, do they come to the meeting? Because if they come to one meeting, they're not going to another meeting because there aren't enough. No, I'm being glib. But the hierarchy, I don't know, because I'm just guessing, like, what questions. If I were going to look at this, I'd certainly look at the hierarchy of who gets invited to what meetings and what seats they have. Because the State Department has been tremendously diminished in numbers, in prowess, and people are leaving. So we'll see what happens there. But it's not the only department like that. So I don't really know the future of it, but it did change significantly in the end of the Bush, but primarily, Obama was a real believer in this. And you'll see, like, when they capture somebody, and when I talked about this two-tiered structure, even if it's not the two-tier structure, they put all the people in the room, like with the underwear bomber, that kind of attacker, and they have the intelligence people, and the military people there, and the law enforcement people, and the local law enforcement people, and they all figure out what to do with this person. And is he gonna go to Guantanamo, theoretically? Is he gonna go into court? We're gonna send him back to where's he gonna go? So there's a real attempt to make decisions in a multilateral way, which is not the same thing as having the President of the United States decide. First her, then you. Yeah.
Yeah, I was wondering where you would put the current administration's seeming desire to prosecute part of this war against terrorism through the immigration and visa system.
Yeah.
And also the ways in which, the courts have been very interesting on this too, right? The legal battle, this issue of civil liberation, it seems to be another interesting place where these things are all intersecting.
Well, one thing interesting about it is this is where the courts have stepped up to the occasion, right? Whether it's Hawaii or whatever, they keep saying, no, you're not, we're going to stop that ban. We're going to interfere with this. We're going to, we're going to have an injunction. The courts don't seem to like whatever iteration of this Muslim anti-Muslim country policy, I don't know how else to say it, Muslim ban, is coming about. So I'm curious watching the courts try to find a way that they can live with themselves and combat the executive, which somehow in terms of how this would play out as counterterrorism strategy, it won't work. So I told you that we keep all the statistics on all these cases. So of 100, and let's include all the people that were shot in their attacks, so of 155 people now that have been either killed in the process of an attack or indicted for terrorist-related things since the beginning of ISIS. Let's just say that the majority are Americans born in America. So, and you'd be shocked at how many are converts. And it's an increasing number that are converts. So how that's going to help, I don't know. Having said that, it's hard to come from other parts of the world to this country, and it's getting much harder. It's hard to go from some parts of this country to other parts of this country. We don't have a deep enough understanding of or compassion for just what that can do to the human being, to deal with things that you're not used to having to deal with, and to do so in a way where you can still respect yourself. And we've not addressed this. And by the way, it's not just for people who come here. It's for people who also are here. The reason, when you think about these violent attacks that we've seen over the past couple of years, in which there have been their share of those that are international terrorism and those which are mass murders, that are not related to international terrorism, we're living in an age of violence with easy access to guns and a lot of very unhappy, anxious, out of control young men. And that's a crisis. And so, I don't want to make you feel bad, but I'll just let you know. So I feel like it makes it so easy to be able to say, wow, this is ISIS, because it's so comforting. We can name that. But if we had to name it, no, a wave of anxiety with guns easily available, that's a little unsettling. So yeah.
I was reading an article in The Economist the other day talking about Italy and how Italy has managed to really stave off a lot of terror activity because of so many years fighting the mafia.
I saw that.
Yeah, and so I'm curious your opinion on that, like this idea of organized crime being sort of a model to kind of use with terrorism.
It's always struck me, why Italy? Because if you look at the other countries of Europe, and Italy has a lot of immigrants and a lot of Muslim immigrants, Albanians and other, and Italy's also a very divided country, and I don't mean divided politically. I mean, I've lived there partly for a while, and it's very divided in terms of how it functions as a unified government as opposed to different, provinces. And so I've always said, is that the thing, that you're just not organized enough for anyway? But then they told me that's not why. But I do think the organized crime model is where law enforcement in this country is how they originally started thinking about terrorism. I do think it is the right model. I do think it de-emphasizes the sort of extra layer of fear you have because of 9/11. And if we were restored to our sanity, that's how, at least in the criminal justice system, we would think about it. The difference is that the United States feels under attack in a interstate way, or even if it's non-state actors, that they at least not feeling like it's going to be attacked both from without and from within. It's not the same feeling that the United States, for reasons that defy, the United States, Americans do not feel safe. Just ask them. They don't feel safe. So why don't they feel safe? The first terrorist attack in New York happens in 16 years, and New Yorkers don't turn around to each other and say, "Wow, 16 years, that's amazing." Given that the Pope comes to New York, something could happen at I got this call today, when we were in the car. They're like, "What should we do about the marathon?" from some journalist. So I'm like, "Run it." So. There has been a tremendous amount of law enforcement uptick, whether we like it or not. There is no politician that will come out and say we're safer than we were on September 10th. And they won't say we were safe on September 10th, because then that looks bad. But they just won't. They won't do it. But I do think that they have handled it a lot, and they've handled it in the courts. And the one place we haven't handled it well is foreign policy, and that was the original crisis that brought 9/11, and that is part of what's inflaming people against us now. Any other questions?
Perfect timing.
Thank you.